Her liver temperature was 90 degrees, and this led the coroner to call time of death between 3 and 5 a.m. And based on the timeline, which we'll go over in a little bit, that's about right. So as Jean's laying there, they noticed that her right nipple was missing an areola, and they can see the creased white scar tissue around it. So it was an older, either a surgery or an accident, whatever the case may be. It wasn't fresh, which is going to be a good identification marker, if they struggle to find who this is. That's something that you can track pretty easy, that type of surgery or that type of infection, whatever happened to her there. Some of the things they did was they gathered some samples of her pubic hair and the hair on top of her head. The rigor mortis was setting in, and her clenched hand had gone rigid. Her face was becoming slight purple at this point. It was a warm day, probably about 90 degrees at that point, the end of June, so they had to move quick on it. So now we'll get into the autopsy findings of Jean. The cause of death was asphyxia due to strangulation by ligature, and there were 2 ligatures around her neck. In this case, a totally, quote-unquote, occlusive double ligature around the victim's neck. And she was also in her menstrual phase. The coroner found a tampon lodged into the rear of the vaginal cavity, and his testing for spermatozoa was positive. So he scraped the spermatozoa and froze it, which, to this day, I wonder, was it enough to test it? I mean, do they still have it today? That would be the question I would ask. Now, it's got to be somewhere. If it's frozen, I would imagine they could link it to, potential family member or something along those lines. He diagrammed 11 total wounds on Jean. Her alcohol reading was 0.08%. There were small carpet-like fibers under the victim's right middle fingernail, so they bagged the victim's clothes and both garrots. The strangling cord measured out at about 17 inches, but knotted down to right at 3 inches. So think about that, 3 inches around her neck. It's insane. So based on the spermatozoa that they found, she obviously engaged in recent sexual intercourse and eaten a full meal 1 to 2 hours before her death. Her stomach contents, and this is going to be very important as they begin their investigation, there were whole kidney beans, meat shards, orange-yellow masses resembling carrots or squash, and yellowish masses resembling cheese. So back then, 1958, they would do radio bulletins, right? An APB. And, it was a pretty solid source to get the public involved. The radio call that went out at 10:10 a.m. Sunday is as follows. On June 22nd, 1958, the strangled body of a woman was found in the El Monte area. She has been identified as Jean Ellroy, also known as Jean Hilliker, also known as Geneva O. Ellroy. It is believed that the suspect either still has in his possession or has thrown away articles of victims' clothing and personal effects, including a purse, description unknown, keys to victim's 1957 Buick, a pair of women's shoes, possibly clear plastic with high heels, a woman's underpants, girdle, and slip. A woman called in, and she said it sounded like her tenant. The way they described her over the radio sounded like her tenant. Her name was Anna Mae Creaky, and if I pronounced that wrong, my apologies. Her last name was spelled Krycki. They met up with her at her house, which sat on the corner at that time, the southeast corner of Maple Avenue and Bryant Road. It was 700 Bryant Road to be exact. And James Ellroy and his mother, they rented a little spot in that backyard, which is on the Maple Avenue side of the street. The Ellroy address was on the Maple Avenue side. Anyways, they roll over there to talk to Anna Mae Creaky and her husband. Mr. and Mrs. Creaky had a 12-year-old son. Well, it was actually Mrs. Creaky's son from another marriage. They all lived in the front house. I think Jean and her son had been staying there for about 4 months at that time. So they show up, kind of ask the usual questions about men and what her social life was like. And And Mrs. Creaky, stuck to her guns on that, is that she didn't think Jean was a heavy drinker. She didn't think she had a boyfriend. She didn't go out much. So that, that left the detectives to think, okay, well, what else could it be, So then they asked Mr. Creaky his whereabouts Saturday night. Now, he stayed home and watched the fight, but he said he watched Jean leave the house between 8 and 8:30 p.m. She left alone, and that was it. Never came back, obviously. Okay, right now we're at 4026 Maple. Used to be 756 Maple. This is where James Ellroy and his mother Jean lived back in June 1958. This was the driveway she backed out of. She took off that fateful night. And unfortunately, we all know what happened next. But this is it right here in El Monte. James Ellroy's father, Armand, detectives questioned him next, and his alibi checked out because he was with his son all weekend. So we're here at 4980 Beverly. This is where James Ellroy and his father lived. James would come here on the weekends, and then to his mother's on the weekdays. Those back three windows there, and that little small window is where they lived. So after his mother was killed, his father was questioned, of course, and it all checked out. They were here that weekend. Back to the Creaky residence. They searched it. They said it was nice and neat. It wasn't a mess. She did leave I think it was a half glass of wine on the table. Jean Ellroy drove a 1957 Buick. Now, during this time, they're looking for this Buick now. 1957 Buick. Officer Dave Wire was cruising around the El Monte 5 Points area and came across the car at 11721 Valley Boulevard, which was a bar restaurant called the Desert Inn. And it was parked in the back there, I think along the west side fence. Okay, so right now we're at 11721 Valley. This was the location of the Desert Inn. If you look at Google Earth, and you can even see it now, you can see the tar where it stood. The tar lines the square where it stood before Valenzuela restaurant. So after the Desert Inn, it was Valenzuela's, but it was all right here. If you go to Google Earth, 11721 Valley in El Monte, you can see the whole square. This is where the blonde woman, the swarthy man, and Jean Ellroy were hanging out that night. There's different accounts of when they were here, when they left. Myrtle Mobby and Bert Outlaw saw the swarthy man and Jean leave at 2 a.m. that night. And that puts them, after this, down at Stan's Drive-In. Another witness, Margie Trewick, she claims to have seen the blonde woman and Jean come into this place at about 10:30ish, somewhere in there, 10:45ish. I could be wrong there, but it was after 10. But it was right here. According to my calculations, they found her car over here. I want to say somewhere in here. I could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong, you guys. So Dave Wire, one of the police officers, found her car parked here. They were going in and out from all the bars and stuff to find her vehicle, which was a 1957 Buick, red and white. They found it here. It was clean. It had empty beer cans in there wrapped up in a brown paper bag, and it was unlocked. But anyways, right here, the Desert Inn. This is incredible to be here because, again, getting a picture of what it looked like then versus being here now, it's surreal. I mean, this is where the blonde woman was seen with Jean Ellroy, and to me, this is one of the strong points of the case because many witnesses had seen her in here. She wasn't a regular though. They didn't recognize her to be a regular, nor was the swarthy man. But yeah, here we are. You can see here we're probably right about where it stood, right in here. They hit the dance floor, probably somewhere in here.